So we have two incredible speakers lined up for today for you. They have extensive experience and careers in the nonprofit, local government, and policy spaces. And we don't want to go through the whole bios, but just refer please to the invitation on the registration that you filled out. They have a full extensive bios, and if you need to look at that again, we can share the invitation to refresh your memory. But first of all, we have Lisa-Nicolle, otherwise known as Nicky Grist. She's Yale College class of '87. Hi, Nicky. She is the Chief of Research, Evaluation, and Finance at Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund, which is an organization that helps embed financial empowerment strategies and services in local governments. And Lisa will tell us more about what Nicky will tell us more about what she does. And Nicky, thank you so much for sharing your time.
My pleasure.
When Matt gets here, we have Matt Klein, who is class of 1993 and Yale Law School class of 1998. He is the Chief Program and Impact Officer at Robin Hood, which is a well-known large nonprofit organization in New York. It's an organization dedicated to funding and advocating for solutions that create permanent pathways out of poverty for New Yorkers. So Nicky, you're here. If you could spend a little time telling us about your organization and what you do.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be part of this. I'm going to actually start off by saying there are probably a lot of experts on this topic in the room already. I'm used to kind of teaching kind of beginner level stuff like this. So if I get too basic, people should feel free to tell me to raise the level. So the Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund is very, very literal name, and Rachel described it very well. We work with mayors and their administrations all around the country. We're in over 100 cities and counties. We sort of use cities for shorthand now, but we work with localities as big as New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, down to counties that in total have populations of 50,000 or more. So for example, Pitkin County in Colorado, which is largely rural. Our job is to provide both funding, so we provide subgrants to local governments and their partners, and also technical assistance, meaning basically consulting services from our staff, and sometimes we hire other consultants to help local governments and their partners. And what we help them do is better achieve their own mission of ensuring that people of moderate means can manage their own finances in the safest, most productive, most affordable way. So we work on consumer financial protection at the local level. We help cities provide free professional financial counseling with no eligibility requirements for their residents. We help people in localities to partner with financial institutions to make sure that people have access to safe and affordable banking accounts. So it's in a nutshell, that is what we do. And my role, leaving aside the fact that I'm the CFO, my role for purposes of this conversation is that to oversee all of our strategic learning and measurement and evaluation work. So
good. Well, while we're there, let's jump in and we can get Matt's take on some of these. Our title of our program is, impact. What is impact? What are we talking about? Impact on whom, on what? And quite frankly, and you've helped me realize, is that the right term we're supposed to be using? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Let's start from the basics.
Absolutely. So impact is a term I actually don't use much. And when Matt comes in, he'll explain that it's not really so bad as what I'm about to say. So from my training, in the evaluation profession, impact means something really specific that is pretty hard to measure and pretty hard to achieve. So we don't spend a lot of time thinking about impact on the evaluation side the way I work on it. So impact for me is, it's like the ultimate long-term vision of an organization. On one hand, on the other hand, it also sort of suggests causality, like you know that your actions made this thing happen. So, so those are really big statements, and we work at a much more humble level of really just thinking about what difference is our work making. We, not trying to show that we're making the ultimate difference in people's lives, right? So, but what are the small steps towards that we really can say that we've achieved and that that our efforts helped contribute to. So, well, I'll stop there and see if that is helpful for the beginning.
Okay, and if anybody has, if you have questions, you can pop it in and say if that is that basic understanding. And is that so, is it just, this is sort of a universal principle, right, that any nonprofit can be applying? I know a lot of the evaluation and impact may be in the kind of medical or social services program evaluation world, and it's good to know that nonprofits and obviously private sectors maybe, but particularly for nonprofits. And so would you say anybody can use this on any scale? Do they have to be as large as your fund, or do you think kind of thinking about impact is something that we could be doing at smaller nonprofits?
Absolutely, everybody should be thinking about whether their work is doing what they want it to be doing. So what we want to know is, how does the work we're doing get us closer to our vision? And how do we get beyond just counting what we do as nonprofit workers, right? Which I would call outputs. There's a little bit of debate about terminology, but I call these outputs. But how do we get beyond just counting our activity to getting some kind of reliable information about what changed as a result of our activity? That's really where we want to go to. What changed as a result? And also, can we only see the results in sort of in the immediate sense? And I'll give you sort of a little example scenario. Like, if I were to tell a joke, and I'm a terrible joke teller, so I'm not going to tell a joke, right? But let's say I was going to tell a joke in this presentation, and you all laughed, right? I would be able to say, I told one joke, that's an output, and you laughed, you thought it was funny, that is a really, really, really short-term outcome, right? I made you laugh. I can take credit for that. If, because I told the joke and you laughed, a week or two later, you still remembered this presentation, that might be a sort of medium-term outcome, right? That you could take credit for. I changed something in your brain, you still remembered what I said. If a few months later, because you remembered what we talked about, you changed something that you were doing at work, and that made your work better, that would be an amazing outcome. Right? That's success. Now, have I changed the world? No, but I've definitely achieved an outcome, and it is actually measurable.
Okay. I love that. I think now we're all going to remember this conversation for just thinking about the joke
So,
analogy.
without me having to try to tell a joke.
All right. So, like, okay, now we have sort of an understanding what impact is, or how you outcomes, how you think about it, ultimately related to things. What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to change? And it could be, like you said, you gave us a couple levels out, and maybe let's say, well, in your organization, what is the impact you're looking at?
Mm. Well, at the Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund, our primary goal is to change the way that local governments think about their responsibility and their capacity to affect the financial empowerment of their residents, right? Ultimately, our goal is, and this is a goal we share with many, many, many other organizations, our goal is financial empowerment, which means that, as I mentioned before, people can manage their finances in a safe, affordable way that advances their goals, and everybody lives happily ever after, right? That's what we all want, but our way of doing that is through local government. That's what makes us unique and special, and that's where our work focuses. So one of the ways we measure our impact is how many local governments are doing something. Have we changed the way a mayor talks about financial empowerment? Have we changed a local government's budget so that they are not just relying on philanthropic funds to pay for some of these services, but they're baselining it in their budget, so which represents a city policy. Right? Those are actually some of the things that we would look to see that as an organization, we're getting closer to achieving our mission. But those aren't the things that the mayors want to see, right? What the mayor wants to see is how many people have been served by the programs that got baselined in the budget. Right? So we also develop, we actually run a national data system so that financial counselors all over the country can record the work that they're doing so that their program managers can report up to local government, and that in the mayor's State of the City address, the mayor can say 300 people got free financial counseling as a result of our city's efforts. And among those 300 people, they increased their savings by $1 million and decreased their debt by $4 million and increased their credit scores by an average of 35 points. Those are really, really important programmatic metrics that we also make sure that our programs are able to collect.
That's actually, that kind of brings me into like the next part of the discussion is like, okay, we have an idea what impact is. You've given us a couple of examples of outcomes and impact, and depending on who's looking at it. But so, what are the kinds of metrics or measurements that, and if, it may be different for every nonprofit. Like, and what are some of the tools you talked about collecting data? You've given some examples, but kind of in a broad sense that might be applicable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. First, and almost anything can be measured in some way, right? But when we talk about metrics and measurement, our minds are going to go a lot to numbers, right? We're going to think a lot about those, that sort of quantitative evidence of success. And as I said, we do use a few numbers, especially the ones that sound good in sound bites, right? But for us, a lot of the way we look at metrics of success is more what we call qualitative, right? Stories. It's how do we describe a change? So because there are both these sort of numeric things you can count and stories you can tell, the range is completely infinite, right? Any organization can, once it's established what its goals are and how it thinks it can get closer to those goals, can start looking at how will we know if we're getting closer to those goals. And that's really all a metric is. Then there are different degrees of rigor with which you try to get evidence of that, and different degrees of rigor with which you try to take credit for having made those goals happen.
So how would a nonprofit, like, how do they determine whether we should be doing quantitative or qualitative, and which quantitative, and, what's, any thoughts on that?
My favorite tool of all time is called a logic model. In international work, it's often called a logical framework or log frame. But it's a very basic, sort of overly linear, unfortunately, way of saying you can work backwards or forwards, but working backwards, which is my preference. Ultimately, we want everybody to live happily ever after. What are some of the preconditions to that we think we can influence? Okay, we found one, which is that they have higher credit scores, right? Or that they're able to buy a house. Let's put it that way. We want people to be able to buy a house. How do we work back from that? Okay, we might need to increase their credit scores. Okay, that's something measurable. We can measure that we've increased a credit score. Now, what activities will we do to help them increase their credit score? That's where you plan your program design, right? But it is a little bit overly linear, but a very, very useful, simple tool.
That sounds a little bit like both quantitative, like sort of quantitative, and a little bit qualitative. You mentioned qualitative, like what is it? You'd mentioned one before, like human-centered design. Like, what are some of the qualitative measures and that you've used and other, you've seen and recommend people think about?
So sometimes people think, well, qualitative just means there's words involved, right? As opposed to numbers,
Numbers versus, yeah,
which is
exactly.
which is kind of basically true, but a qualitative measure means is really more about uh, being able to really quite rigorously describe the kind of change you want to see, and then find that change and describe that that change occurred in a way that people will really believe, right? So I'm not sure I could come up with a great example of this, but maybe I'll just start from our own work. Um, some of our work really involves what we call systems change, right? We're not trying to do something that just gets one person one step forward. We're trying to change the whole way a city operates. Or a lot of people talk about building ecosystems now, right? So it's very, very popular buzzword. How do you measure whether an ecosystem has been built? How do you measure whether a coalition is effective? How do you measure those things? Well, you can measure them, but not really with numbers. So, for example, there are some scales that have been created, or surveys that have been created for surveying all the members of a coalition and seeing how well they think things are going, right? If everybody, and then you can actually get to something that sounds kind of quantitative. If you can say 75% of coalition members think the coalition is stronger this year than it was last year, you've actually created a quantitative measure. But if you want to know how did that happen and who takes credit for it, you have to really ask questions. And can you tell by the stories that people share with you that, oh, it was because we funded a permanent staff position that all of a sudden the coalition started working better together, because that permanent staff member was able to make phone calls and call meetings and have effective agendas and share notes, and right, and all those things weren't really happening before. So that can't come out in numbers, right? For that, and that's actually literally something that we do. So we fund staff positions for coalitions, and so how do we know that they're effective? In part by the number of meetings they have, but in part because people tell us the staff person made a difference.
Are these sort of unsolicited, or do you have a purposeful way to go out and collect specific kinds of qualitative? You just said surveys, but do you have people out in the field? Do you have groups that come in? Do you do interviews, or how do you do that?
It can really be both, but it's clearly much more reliable if you go after it. So in our first year of funding staff people for coalitions, we didn't have funding for an evaluation, and so I just sort of taught the whole team of things to listen for. And we literally had everybody writing in our Slack channel every time they heard somebody say what made a difference. So it was just our team members, of the people who were providing our technical assistance services, knowing that they should listen for keywords or meaningful phrases and just jot them all down. That was all we could do in the first year. Right. Now we're looking at hiring consultants to do a rigorous method called outcome harvesting, and we haven't committed to this in any way, so in case anybody's listening, but it's the rigorous way of doing that. It's a well-defined technique that involves determining in advance what we think the outcomes could have been, should be, looking for documentation that suggests that they might have happened out there somewhere in the world, and then interviewing lots of people to try to trace back how they happened, and then substantiating your theory by going back to people or maybe other people and saying, okay, we think that, Rachel calling the meeting was what really made the difference. Do you think that's what made the difference? So there are ways to make it more and more and more rigorous, even though it's just qualitative. Basically, it all involves talking to people or reading things people have written.
That's beautiful. It sounds like those are things anybody can kind of implement with some, as you said, you just started one time. Like there are ways you can kind of get going on collecting some stuff, and some may lead to quantitative, and otherwise we'll start to have some more rigor, it sounds like, in the qualitative information you're collecting. One question, you mentioned something about this outcomes harvesting technique, and if you have any resources like that, we'd love to hear that. Are there other sort of standards for metrics in, in the fields that nonprofits could refer to, or places to go to kind of learn like what some of these metrics might be?
Yeah, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit from metrics to methods, right?
Methods, beautiful.
My favorite website that I'm always going to look for methods is called betterevaluation.org. I think it's great, betterevaluation.org. This lists out all sorts of interesting methods that people have used with examples on how to use them. There's an American Evaluation Association that I'm a member of and rely on quite a lot, where people are sharing information. I will just a plug for evaluation professionals. They're really nice, right? You can call an evaluation professional and they'll tell you what they know. People love talking to each other. And I also should, as a complete aside, I'm going to say that the evaluation profession right now is suffering. So please be nice to evaluators and talk to them. And there are probably a lot of people out there right now who are looking for jobs and who have a lot of skills that they really need to be able to go back to using and sharing.
Are they specialized in certain, like, healthcare or, housing or this thing, or is it just, it's a general principle of how to evaluate impact and measurement, things like that? Like how?
A little of both. I mean, I would say that, an evaluation mindset and evaluation skill set is extremely transferable. But once people develop an expertise in a field, it shortens their learning curve a lot, right? So, um, uh, I think it depends on, whether you really want a certain skill set or whether you really want to not have to explain the intricacies of workforce development or breastfeeding or whatever the thing is that you're trying to study. If they need to know that jargon in advance, you look for those.
It's like hiring a consultant who may not be familiar with your particular industry or your mission. Now, I know when we spoke earlier with Matt, there were some other ones that were raised. I had never heard of some of these. That there is actually there's somebody's trying to do these global metrics attempt, this impact genome registry. Have you ever looked for that or?
Yes, I've heard of them. So yes, there are people who are trying to literally standardize metrics. There are a lot of efforts to do that, and they keep coming up because, frankly, none of them have worked yet. So maybe they'll find one that works. But if everybody's doing exactly the same thing, sure, you can measure it the same way. But if everybody's doing exactly the same thing, they probably all shouldn't be doing it. Right?
Right.
You probably got a lot of duplication of services. So, a big funder, let's say I used to run a housing counseling organization. And we were funded by HUD to help people solve their local housing problems, right? So on a one-on-one basis, we would help a tenant get repairs from their landlord. We would help a homeowner make repairs to their home, things like that. HUD established a series of metrics, and every single housing counseling organization in the country had to report back to HUD on exactly those things. That makes sense. That's standardized metrics. There's a lot of that out there, especially with government funding. But once you get beyond doing work that has been prescribed by your funder and the funder is telling you what to measure, if an organization has its own unique mission and is approaching it in its own unique way, then it should be determining its own unique metrics and trying to standardize them all so that you can come to an apples to apples comparison. That works kind of on the finances, like everybody agrees on what assets and liabilities are and what an operating reserve is, and there's even debate about that. But standardizing how you're trying to help change the world, I think, is a little challenging, which does not mean people don't keep trying to do it.
Right. We came up, we were sort of thinking about brainstorming a little bit of some of these other places where people are looking at, comparing or measuring. We have a Yale Kat Rusketa, class of '89, who is at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy, looking at what kinds of nonprofits or what is high impact and how do you figure that out. And you had a good article that you said you thought was very good. I'm going to put that in the chat. That's an interesting organization. We've had her speak before, but I would put that in there. There are other things like, and I don't know if they have metrics associated with this necessarily, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Like, are I've seen a lot of organizations will throw that on their website or say, oh, we're meeting the measurements for those kinds of things. Obviously, a lot of the big consulting firms like McKinsey or the nonprofit spinoff Bridgespan have a lot of papers and things that they've done about how do you measure what matters and things like that, setting results. I'll throw a couple in. I would also encourage, if anybody in the audience has some articles or research or programs that they like, that they rely on or think are very good. I'm always a big fan of collecting good resources and well-respected. We don't necessarily have the equivalent of peer-reviewed journals, but something that is sort of standardized, or at least people highly respect and can implement. So those are just, if you have anything that you guys like to look at, drop it in. Okay, so we talked about what is impact. You've given us some ideas. We just, you told us a lot about, what are the kinds of metrics or measurements? Could they be standardized? Where do they work? How do you figure that out? What to use? Ultimately trying to see how well are we doing in working towards what we ultimately want to solve. That seems to be, that works. What are, other than just looking at that, so what else can people use this kind of information, this gathered measurements? What is it used for? Otherwise, obviously, we're like, are you meeting your mission? That's a good board and internal, discussion. Are we doing the right things? Are we actually changing things? What is this kind of information also used for? And does it change? Do you have different ways of collecting or sharing the information depending on what it's being used for?
Oh, absolutely. The first thing that performance measurement should be used for is performance management. So I love logic models. I also love the phrase, we manage what we measure. It is just so true. And it's kind of hard to manage what we don't measure. So the absolute first reason to be looking at how well are we doing is so that we can do better, right? And so that our own staff feel the pride in their work of knowing that they've accomplished not just like, okay, I got this done today, but over the year, what have we gotten done? And I'll tell you a quick story on that. As I said, I used to manage a housing counseling organization, and this was in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. We helped tenants, and we helped people buy their own homes, and we helped homeowners. Well, helping people buy their own homes gives you some really, really easy, big numbers, right? We helped 10 people buy homes, and then you can say how much those homes were worth. It's New York City, could be worth $500,000, right? Easily, right? So, our home buying staff member could always be proud of the not only the number of mortgages that she helped people to apply for successfully, but the value of those mortgages. Right? She was the only person on staff who could put a dollar value to her efforts. And so we thought, it's not that she's the only person whose work has a dollar value impact on people's lives, right? So we started measuring how much rent did our tenant organizer, our tenant assistance person, help people get paid back to their landlord by helping them get public assistance money. Right? It's called a one-shot deal. Right? How much back rent did we help people pay? Right? And it turned out to be many, many, many thousands of dollars. And all of a sudden, things changed in our office, right? Because it was no longer just one person who had a dollar value to their work, right? Now we had a rent dollar value, and we could have a home repairs dollar value. And it, it literally changed the dynamic, right? So that's really the first reason to think about measuring your work and measuring it appropriately is what stories are you telling yourself, right? What stories are you telling your staff? What stories can you tell your community about why you're doing this? And it's also really, really important on that note to have measures that matter to your community, because that's who you're working for, right? So if nobody in our community cared about money, if we were in a, I don't know, an ascetic community of hermits that didn't care about money for I don't know where you're spent, that would not have been a good choice. So, so what are you measuring that's really going to change things? Maybe we should be measuring how many children got to stay in homes or got to move to better homes, right? That's actually not something we measured out. Maybe that would have been a good idea, right? Because that might have really resonated with the neighborhood we were serving. And that would have been a perfectly good metric.
So
So
it sounds like you're kind of going by your program is let that be an obvious first place to start. So at some point, you've decided, or the organization decides, these are the services or that we deliver, the program we deliver. So we've gone through this theory of change, or we've looked at what we ultimately want to do. We've worked back, and then you kind of let that be the guiding principles. And it sounds like you started, or somebody already had one, and you use that, and then you can start thinking about, well, what are these other things that we can do? So that's a good idea for nonprofits. Even if you only provide one measure or one particular service, there are probably components of that, I would gather, right? That you can start to think about, how can we see, attach a number, or what is it saving, what is it preventing, something like that. So I love
really,
that example.
why should people care about our work? Yeah.
Why should we?
What
No,
do people care about in our work? And can we tell them we're doing that thing? Um,
right.
so performance management, if one of the things that we measure is how many people can one financial counselor serve. And we look at that because we really wanted to set targets, so we want to say, okay, one financial counselor should serve this many people, so that because local governments wanted to know, well, how will I know if the nonprofit that I contract to do this work, how do I know if they're doing a good job? We want to be able to tell them, okay, well, they're doing a good job if they see X number of people. Turns out that's a really hard number to figure out because there's so much variety and there's so many reasons that things change and all. So we've actually kind of struggled with coming up with a good target number for that because it depends a lot. So you really have to think about how the number is going to be used, what audience needs that number. Obviously, if there's an organization about impact philanthropy, it kind of tells you that philanthropists like seeing some reports on impact. Right? So funders are definitely an audience, but they're quite variable in what they're looking for.
Yeah, we can talk about some of the specifics, about what this data, what information you talked about, funders or potential funders. Obviously, if you want to be able to tell the stories about how what your organization does, how effective it is in achieving that, and hopefully people support your mission and can see that you're being successful. Obviously, there are places like, what Cat does, the impact philanthropy, that are themselves doing, and we've certainly seen, like, what is the return? Right, I forget the organization that shows about, return for every dollar that, whether it's GuideStar, like what's the efficiency of the funding or the efficiency of the organization in reaching their services or constituents. So there are a lot of ways that it can be measured. One thing you've talked about, which is like there's a larger goal. And I think, you work with sort of systems in a way, picking and figuring out, like you talked in the beginning about how, mayors or other politicians might need to do that one for, say that they're serving their constituents, or if it's an election year, what are the ways to do it? Or if you're working with governments and you need to justify the federal grants you're getting, something like that. What about, like, can you just talk, like, kind of broadly how a specific organization's particular, nonprofit measurements of their services or their effectiveness, how that might relate to the larger communities or systems? And I know you have some experience with that.
there's a pretty long-standing effort now that's quite widespread to, I think they call it collective impact or shared impact, where usually sponsored by a philanthropic source of some kind, maybe local government, a number of organizations who are either all working on the same topic or all working in the same geographic area will try to share metrics to show that even if one organization can't change the whole neighborhood, look at what we're doing together to change the neighborhood. That's an important effort. I haven't tracked it in several years, but I know it's still very much active. There were efforts to create data systems that everybody would feed into that are just super hard to do. But the idea that changing a whole neighborhood takes multiple organizations working on multiple topics all at the same time, and none of them can take credit for changing the neighborhood, but how about if we talk about them all together and have a neighborhood-wide series of metrics that we're looking at that everybody's contributing to? I think that's a very important approach.
Have you ever been part of one of those kind of collective, either in your organization now or in previous ones?
Very early in my career, I was part of something called the Comprehensive Community Revitalization Program, which was extremely ambitious of trying to change neighborhoods across the South Bronx, and it was tough. That was in the very early 90s when this kind of thing was just starting. So yes, I have been. That was before data systems were trying to be built for that kind of thing, though.
Interesting. We could cover a whole thing about kind of collaboration and working towards, achieving a systemic change, whatever. And in fact, if you come to our conference, we're going to be talking about partnerships and collaborations, and this may be one of the things we're going to cover. Nicky, tell us, do you know, it may not be, you have a larger organization than maybe a lot of the nonprofits in our space. And so the same person who's collecting the data may also be preparing the reports out to the funders and things. As an organization, you guys actually have to run your own, and actually Robinhood does too. You have to raise your own money, or somebody in your organization to raise your money. Do you have a direct connection, or do you know how, or are you told what you need to be collecting? Or the programs you work with, do you have any connection? Give us a sense of what is information you're using and how is that used out for your funders or community members, things like that.
Yeah, luckily I don't have to write those reports. But and I would also say, luckily, and somewhat unusually, our organization is funded entirely by the private sector. And if there are people in the room working at nonprofits, I'm sure you might also have experienced that private sector donors can be a little bit more flexible and a little bit less demanding than say HUD.
Are you saying, when you say, sorry, private sector, do you mean individuals or companies, like
corporations?
Corporations.
Yes. So yeah, corporate philanthropy. In my personal experience, I'm not speaking as a philanthropy expert. I'll just say in my personal experience, corporate donors require less detailed reporting than foundations, which require less detailed reporting than government. Nonetheless, they do require reports, and we've actually built out some dashboards and all to collect information for some of our donors. If they're funding the financial counseling, that's easy to do because there's a lot of things you can count in financial counseling. But we actually spend quite a bit of time thinking about, as I said much earlier, how do we tell the system change story to our donors so that they'll find it compelling and keep funding this work? And that is what I get involved in. Is how do we decide what would be credible evidence of system change, and then go out and find that credible evidence and write it up in a clear enough way that it will be compelling to our funders.
Amazing. I want to make sure we have some time for a Q&A. One last thing, Nikki, do you have any sort of last advice for nonprofits, maybe who are kind of just getting started in measuring, conveying their impact, or things that you said, gosh, I wish I'd done that, or wish I'd known about that when I first started on this path?
Um, Given that your question is about people that are just starting, I'm going to assume that they're small and don't have a lot of resources. Okay. Yes, I would say go find a logic model workshop. Right? Um, and uh, and the reason is that it will help you trace from what activities you want to do to what difference that might make in the short and long run. And even if you don't get the metrics out of that, it'll put you on the right path. And then be creative and don't be afraid to talk to people in the evaluation profession. As I mentioned, they love talking about their work. We love talking about our work, obviously. Um, and ask people, how would you measure this? Read other organizations' annual reports, if that's still a thing, or I guess their websites. See what they've measured and see whether it fits. And most especially, ask the community you care most about, whether that's the people who are coming to you for services or their parents or your individual donors. You know, if you're gathering, if you're collecting money from your friends, ask your friends what they care about, what they'd want to hear, and see if that's measurable.
Excellent, excellent. Nick, thank you so much for giving this, great overview and walk through some of the components of what it is, how you do it, what its uses are, and some theoretical approaches to it, systems changes. Would love to take some questions if anybody in the audience either wants to share what they're doing at their organization or if they have any questions. We don't have a huge group here, so I'm going to go back to the whole multi-speaker and unpin myself. And if someone I think you can hit the raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask it. Josiah, is that your hand raised?
Yes, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Nikki. I wanted to ask you, Nikki, you mentioned about building out dashboards. Would you explain how you've done that? Do you use kind of off-the-shelf software? Have you customized dashboards? Please provide a few examples.
Let me think about that a moment. We use Salesforce, and so many organizations use Salesforce that I really can't say not to use it. But it's pretty affordable. They have nonprofit deals, but I also don't really want to say that you have to use that. And it does take quite a bit of customization to really work, depending on what kind of work you're doing. So it's not what I would first recommend. So I'm going to pull this way back and think about what is a dashboard and why would you want one before jumping to how you would build one. Right? And maybe that's how you think about what you would use to build it. Right. So a dashboard is the sort of the key figures that might come from multiple reports that you're able to present in a way that is clear enough that somebody looking at it will understand the picture. That's a really hard thing to achieve in the first place, right? To get that level of clarity from a few key numbers or maybe bar graphs or something, right? Our minds don't really work that way that well. So first I would think about who wants to know what, if you're in sales, it's kind of easy, right? And that's why Salesforce is called Salesforce. And that's why so many workshops that you go to about like how to use Excel to do this or that, like they always use sales figures. They almost never use nonprofit outcome figures because it's kind of hard to fit our things in. Maybe if you're in education, that's kind of, it might be easier. You can say, oh, how many students were in class today and what were their scores on these tests? You could probably do that on a dashboard. And maybe it would be meaningful to your audience. There might not be that many other things, depending on what your mission is, that fit on a dashboard. So the first thing I would do would be to say, like, are there 5 numbers that change frequently, or 5 charts, that change frequently enough that I need to see them in kind of almost real time, and that would tell me a really meaningful story about our work? And if there are, great. Often you can do it in Excel. And if you can't, you probably end up with something like Salesforce, or really Power BI, which is the way we're going, because Salesforce dashboards are still pretty limited in as soon as you try to get a little bit creative. So something like a Power BI, I'm just going to ramble now. Power BI is the kind of software that can grab information from lots of other places and reassemble it and present it in a really snazzy way. Tableau is another one like that, that people use. And obviously I'm a little bit of a skeptic.
Okay, some good
Now,
tools.
if you ask me as a CFO, I have a totally different answer, but I'm talking from my evaluation hat.
Thank
Someone
you.
has a comment that AI is increasingly useful to produce charts. Have you used that, or has anybody else used that to throw in your metrics or your information and see what it kind of produces? Oh. Nicky, I think you're frozen, but
I'm a late adopter.
late adopter. If anybody else in the audience has used it, I've tried it, taking a bunch of things and asking it to give help me draft an annual report on, and I just load our website or this, reports, this thing and that thing. It's not bad. It's a good first draft, as they say. It's like having a good first summer intern or a first year associate take a first draft for you. I'd be curious if people are using it in more sophisticated ways, like you said, to kind of create dashboards, to come up with metrics, things like that. So if anybody's there, and come to our conference, we're doing, or come to our program in 2 months, we're doing one on AI and technology for nonprofits. So maybe we'll look to cover some of these things. Any other questions from the audience? You can raise your hand. I'll try to go through. Any other use cases people have questions about? Okay, I think we're quiet. Nicky, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm sorry Matt couldn't join us this evening. I would say go to you guys have a great website, I think, and so does Robinhood. Obviously, they have a lot of data that they use as well. I thought your GuideStar, survey was about, somebody took a lot of time to summarize what you guys do, and that was a nice, concise way. I thought your recommendation of looking at annual reports, a lot of people are trying to take what they do and put it in nice fancy graphs. I think that's a really good suggestion. People are doing maybe like program reports are not necessarily doing it. Anyway, lots of places to kind of look at some precedent out there. So hopefully everyone, you got some ideas, a little bit better understanding. If this is new to you, a couple of resources you can go look at if you want to learn and dive more deeply. Hope this helps you and your work and your nonprofit. We look forward to having you back next month. We're working on, I think, policy and advocacy for nonprofits. And then after that, we'll be doing AI and technology. And soon to be released, all the topics we're covering at our conference. So Nicky, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, and keep up the amazing work, really setting a beautiful standard for how to do this work rigorously and effectively. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience for joining us. This is being recorded. You'll be able to come back and look at it again. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again, Nicky.